Good afternoon, everybody. Good morning to those of you in other time zones. My name is John Muchek. This is my 13th year at Microsoft. I help large enterprise clients on the East Coast with technology strategy. I spent the last 6 years helping those clients specifically around adoption of Azure, which is in almost every case that I've seen a really form of a hybrid strategy in one way or the other. And so we're going to talk a lot about that today. We're going to talk about a few things here. And really, I think that we start by asking the question, like, what does it mean to be ready for a future where the state of the art is changing constantly, right? Developers are building new applications. They have to respond to market demands at a pace that's, just much faster than we've ever seen before. As they build and deploy applications, operations now has to catch them. They have to support them. They have to secure them. And those applications aren't stagnant. They don't sit by themselves, right? They're constantly changing. And so operations has to keep up as well. And in that process, what we find is that one size just doesn't fit all. And every time we make a choice to bring an additional stack, either a development language or an operational tool, into the fold, like, we absolutely do add some complexity. And so we know you aren't going to just have one stack, right? We live in a heterogeneous world. It's not going to live in just one data center or in one cloud. But trying to manage all of that diversity with traditional approaches, I think, will certainly fail. And I've seen a lot of challenges in large customers that take on a lot of these innovative characteristics and maybe do it without looking at their underlying process of how are they going to manage it, how are they going to secure it, and they end up having to sort of play catch up. We always get the questions about governance and about security, right? Those are top of mind really as you're deploying to the cloud. A lot of people want to know, hey, I've got a lot of infrastructure running in my current data center and I want to leverage the cloud. I want to use some of the benefits of the cloud without having to actually pick up and move the workload. And so at the same time, you want to modernize those current data centers. So you don't want to necessarily just leave them behind, or in some cases you can't. So over the years of working with you, right, you guys have taught Microsoft all of these challenges. Like, we've learned together on how to overcome them on-prem. And our entire mission is to empower folks like you to build more, to do more on the platform that we provide. And so we built Azure from the ground up, designed from the beginning to sort of meet these challenges of a heterogeneous and very hybrid environment.
Hey, John?
Yeah.
By the way, everyone's commenting how cool the voice to text translation works. This is one of the really powerful tools of the cloud. And as we expand internationally, it'll be even cooler because I'm sure people could pick their preferred language and then it could automatically be translated into Spanish, French, Chinese, whatever the case may be. And I'm sure they have some ability to also translate the words into different characters with a lot of the languages like Mandarin and whatnot. Very cool there, John.
Yeah, no, that's great. And feel free to jump in since I don't see the chat. Yeah, this is powered by one of Azure's cognitive services for translation. It's built right into PowerPoint, so it's just like 2 clicks to turn it on. And it does, in addition to just doing transcription, but it also does translation across multiple languages, so that if we were actually sharing this slide directly rather than through a video webcast, you'd all be able to choose your language that you want to listen to me into. So, but anyway, I digress, but thanks for the comment, Ron. So I'm going to cover a lot of ground. Ron always does manage to squeeze about 3 topics into a single topic session, but I really am going to attempt to uncover these 3 truths. I'm going to try to go through this quickly. Happy to take questions about Azure in general. But the 3 areas that I really think are important to touch on is that not everyone, but most of you already know that the most cost-effective, most achievable way forward is going to be a hybrid cloud. So we're going to talk about that both in short, medium, and long term. What does that multi-dimensional sort of problem look like? Second, as we really move forward around a cloud strategy, whether it be a hybrid strategy or a pure cloud strategy, the old playbook for IT operations just isn't going to be enough. We really need to invest in automation, as Aaron was saying earlier, and a software-defined control plane that allows us to keep up with those application changes at the same pace that the developers are creating them. And finally, honestly, everything's just changing too quickly for all of us to be the smartest one in the room, right? There's no way for any one of us to be an expert in Azure or in AWS or in security, right? We need to learn from each other, and we need to grow on top of each other's advancements. And ultimately, we see the open source community and sort of open source principles as being really important to this progress. So those are the three that I'm going to try to talk about today. These are also, I think, the reasons why companies like J.B. Hunt, KPMG, Allscripts, Chevron, others have adopted some of Microsoft's approach for hybrid cloud. They're working with Azure. In fact, over 95% of the Fortune 500 do use Azure, and the majority of those have a hybrid cloud strategy. We're not talking anymore about whether or not people should use cloud or why they should use cloud as much as how. How am I going to maximize my investment that I already have on-prem, take advantage of the cloud, do all of these things all at once? So there's a lot of reasons why my customers adopt a hybrid cloud strategy. I think they fall into two categories. First, there's technical reasons. These are really powerful reasons. Some workloads just can't live in a public cloud, maybe due to regulatory or data sovereignty requirements. Highly regulated industries sometimes run into this. Some workloads, especially workloads on the edge, require very low latency. Or maybe they need to communicate with a mainframe that's on-prem. That's not moving to a public cloud directly. And so, or maybe they just, you have a sunk investment in data center facilities that you need to see out to its, to its financial end. You need to have resilience across different clouds or different locations. And so there are good technical reasons why I might do this. There are also what I categorize as business reasons, right? If you're an ISV, then you want to be everywhere your customers are. It doesn't really matter to you which cloud, and you should target as many of them as you can. You might have a significant investment in data center on the books. That's not a technical requirement, but it is something that's very real to your business. It's real money. And finally, you may choose, to just distribute your risk across multiple solutions or multiple providers. Depending upon your situation, one of these might be a valid reason, all of them might be valid reasons, but we do have to be wary of the costs that they bring. They're expensive decisions, right? And so things like, best of breed have always led to potentially higher costs for overall TCO. So we have to have this similar considerations when we're talking about just how many different environments we're going to bring into the fold. That's why we call this a multidimensional problem. A hybrid platform must proactively address both technical and business requirements so that you can go forward in a cost-effective way. Lots of dimensions to hybrid. Let's start with the one that everybody thinks about first, which is infrastructure. And in many ways, this is the least common denominator, right? It's also the most portable. It's a virtual machine. It's a petabyte of storage. And while it might take some work to move them, we have confidence that they will move and sort of run the same no matter where I put them. Now, if we just talk about the Azure platform all up, in a hybrid strategy, public cloud, we think, is going to be the majority scenario over time. The economies of scale that we and other hyperscale providers like AWS and Google can get just at our global footprint are like nothing that an enterprise could ever achieve themselves. And so we do see a lot of workloads going to public cloud. For ourselves, we have 60 regions around the world, and all of these regions connected with our own dark fiber network, building a backbone that you can take advantage of for your own workloads. This is also a super critical way for us to all invest in a more sustainable compute future where we can get these economies of scale of a public cloud. That being said, though, there are those workloads that you are going to you're going to run on-prem. And since very early days of Azure, we've invested in this thing called Azure Stack, which is essentially your own stamp of Azure that you can run in your own data center or maybe in a partner data center or in a colo. And that story has really evolved over time to include a portfolio of offerings that gives you a lot of different choices about how you might want to take advantage of cloud technologies without deploying to a public cloud. So I'll just walk through these quickly. Azure Stack Hub is where it all began. It's what used to just be called Azure Stack. This is a fully managed rack that lives in your data center. It's built and provided by one of our major hardware partners. Any of the big names that you're probably buying your servers and PCs from today. And it allows you to deploy Azure services into your own private region is one way to think about it. But in doing so, you're going to use the same consistent Azure portal interface, the same API layers in order to do your deployment and management and operations. And so you don't have to learn something new in order to deploy both into Azure and on-prem. It can also run in a connected mode where it is connected and talking to Azure, or a completely disconnected mode for those workloads where you don't have internet connectivity or for regulatory purposes you can't have them. And so this is sort of think of it at, like I said, as your own region of Azure deployed wherever you want it around the world. This is super popular across industries. Financial services, like the Hong Kong Exchange uses this. Aerospace and defense industry uses this heavily for, again, those very highly secured, highly regulated environments where even though they appreciate that the certain workloads can run in a highly secure, let's say, sovereign government cloud in Azure, there are some that need to be very close to a shop floor, or maybe very close to a battlefield, or very close to a tactical front, or on an aircraft carrier, or in a submarine. The middle class of these hybrid offerings is what we call Azure Stack HCI for hyperconverged infrastructure. And these are Microsoft validated hardware integrated solutions that are available from a large number of partners that you can purchase and, again, deploy into a colo or your own data center. And these are focused really on running virtualized applications on premises, but again, using a common control plane to manage them. So you might use it for offsite backup or for remote branch office scenarios, disaster recovery, update management. And again, it's all managed from Azure, but out into this hybrid cloud. See. And then the final one is what we call Azure Stack Edge. This actually comes in two forms. There's a commercial series of hardware appliances that we intend for most enterprise data centers or your own edge locations, your branch offices. And then there's a ruggedized series for harsh environments that also includes a battery-powered form factor that would allow it to be carried around in a backpack, either on the tactical edge or in a first responder kind of scenario or others. And these are really interesting because not only is it an extension of Azure that you pay for on a metered basis, you don't actually even have to buy the hardware up front, but we have models that include GPU as well as FPGAs for accelerated machine learning at the edge. And so if I want to deploy these to a shop floor or to into a retail environment, again, I can get a fully Azure managed experience. I can build cloud native, cloud first applications. And I can also use these for your storage scenarios where you're looking to archive storage or to create a connected path between your on-prem storage appliances up into Azure. So in the retail scenario, right, these are being used in order to do things like real-time inventory on store shelves, to use AI to do guided shopping experiences, and even to connect retail employees to back-end systems even while the store is disconnected. We also see these being used in manufacturing. Cree is archiving these millions of high-quality images that they take in their manufacturing process in order to train a machine learning model that can spot defects and errors much earlier in the manufacturing process than their normal quality control checks that typically happen towards the end. That saves a lot of money and time, but again, would be very difficult to do in a pure cloud scenario because of the speed at which this manufacturing line operates. And Esri is using Datadog Edge to actually send out into the field so that their employees can update geo models while they're in the field, even if they're disconnected. And so all of these are examples of the necessity of, the technical necessity that sometimes we really do need a hybrid cloud. We need to be able to deploy to multiple different locations because of the nature of the workload. Now, in some cases, like with VMware, maybe it's not such a specialized use case. Maybe it is a general purpose use case, but you have a very significant investment in VMware in your enterprise data center. You're looking to maybe consolidate data centers, close a data center, maybe implement a disaster recovery where you didn't have it before. And rather than go through the lift that would be necessary to adopt a whole new tool chain associated with deploying and monitoring these servers, you just want to be able to pick up those VMware servers and run them in Azure. And so we can do that as well. So again, another example of how we think of multi-cloud, we think of hybrid as being a multi-dimensional problem to solve. That it might be a technical, it might be a business reason that you want to modernize. Now, that's infrastructure, and that tells part of the story. But what about that next layer up? How does Azure support building portable, modern applications that operate in a hybrid environment? Hybrid applications they require a little bit different approach than infrastructure, because if we boil an application back down to servers and storage, we're sort of ignoring the major benefits that cloud native architecture can offer. We're going to avoid and ignore the PaaS services, the various platform offerings that any cloud might offer your developers and your operations folks. And if we ignore those, then we're really not seeing the full benefit of the cloud. So a modern application, it's really like an orchestration of services, right? We loosely connect components through APIs and message passing interfaces. And we want to take advantage of those interfaces to build in portability and flexibility at the application layer specifically. And that way we can swap out individual services. I think the best way to talk about this is to give you an example. In this case, we're going to talk about ASOS, their e-commerce platform that they built as a cloud-native application to run in Azure. This is the core of their business, and so I think it's a great example of something that's not only mission critical, but has really interesting scale requirements when we think about e-commerce and retail in general, and the ability to scale up to something like a Black Friday kind of requirements. So they have. They see great performance. That's great. I want to skip through and talk a little bit about the architecture. And at first, you're going to notice and wonder, well, how is this representative of a hybrid application? It's true. All of this is actually running in Azure, in the public cloud. But again, getting hybrid applications right is more about the architecture than it is about hosting. So let's look at the choices that they made. The bulk of their business logic is running in Kubernetes. In this case, it's running an Azure Kubernetes service, which is our managed version of, or it's our managed offering for open source upstream Kubernetes. So there's nothing special there. It just means you don't have to deal with the weeds of Kubernetes. But those containers could easily be picked up and run in Kubernetes on a different cloud if they needed to or they wanted to. Other constructs, you can see they're using Service Bus. That creates that loosely coupled system that we talked about. The database here is Cosmos DB, but that's a multimodal database. It's a cloud-native database that has a lot of different interfaces, and some of those interfaces are like Mongo or Cassandra, standards-based interfaces. That means I could actually pick up that data and move it on-prem or move it to another cloud without having to make major changes to my application. Azure Functions and Redis Cache are actually both open source projects. And so while we're running them in Azure here, you could run them on-prem or in another cloud, no problem. So, and then on top of everything else, we're using a DevOps pipeline in order to manage and automate the deployment of it. We're going to talk more about how the important automation is, but that really minimizes the manual effort that would be required to make changes behind the scenes here, right? So all in all, we're looking at a very hybrid capable architecture that's deployed 100% in Azure today, but could live in a different cloud. It could potentially even be split through these loose couplings depending upon the performance requirements. So, as I said, your goal here is not on the application level when you think about a multi-cloud strategy or you think about hybrid. Your goal is not zero change portability of the entire system, right? That road leads you right back down to infrastructure. If I want to be able to take up the whole application and just drop it and all of its entrapments or all of its trappings, out to another provider, then I'm really going to get down to that least common denominator conversation, and then that we're robbing ourselves of some of the benefits. So some components like Kubernetes, they're easily and seamlessly moved from one environment to the other. Others, like the management tools you use, the connectivity tissue between these applications, those are naturally going to be more specific, whether you're deploying it on-prem or in Azure or in another cloud. But that's okay, because let's be honest, we don't pick up and move entire applications that often, right? Not like you could potentially with a generic virtual machine. It's more likely that application components are going to change. They're going to be lifted out, they're going to be rotated, they're going to be iterated, because the design is flexible enough to handle that. So we talked about two different tiers. Infrastructure tier, which is mostly about hybrid, is a construct of place. Where do I need to run this? Why do I need to run it there? Maybe it's a business reason, maybe it's a technical reason, maybe a combination, right? At the application tier, these usually are technical reasons where I run them close to my user. I want to run it close to the hardware that it has to interface with. I need to beat that speed of light problem, and so I need to run it in a specific location. But I also want to be able to swap out different technologies under the covers without having to do major rewrites whenever that comes up. Okay, so we got a little bit deep there. We're going to finish off on this first truth, right? So let's bring it back up. We'll talk about everybody's favorite subject, licensing. No, that's, I know nobody likes to talk about licensing. I don't either. And so I'm just going to say this one thing, right? It is relevant to lots of you as you deploy hybrid cloud strategies. Not only does Windows and SQL run best, perform best on Azure, but you really can reuse your on-prem licenses, and that can have a very dramatic impact on the total cost. So again, when you look at a multi-cloud or a hybrid strategy, it's multi-dimensional. You have to think about more than just place, but also technologies, flexibility in deployment, and then also you're ultimately, as we've seen time and time again, cost is a huge deciding factor. Okay, second truth. Old infrastructure playbook is not going to be good enough. And this really starts as you listen to me go on and on, talk about how you can deploy workloads. I'll have this running in my on-prem data center, and this application is going to run in Azure. And I'm going to have this other one running over here in AWS, and maybe this runs in a colo that somebody else hosts for me. But if you're in the IT ops world right now, you're thinking, man, I've got every one of those I add in. I have a whole nother set of tools that I need to manage, a whole nother sort of set of processes and checklists that I have to create in order to make sure that I can deploy it, monitor it, upgrade it, secure it. And so this sprawl gets complex. It gets expensive very quickly. So our answer to this is something that we call Azure Arc. And Azure Arc is the result of sort of our thinking in terms of how do you abstract away enough of the management, security, governance aspects of running a multi-cloud or a multi-hybrid environment without undercutting the value of each of those environments. Right? If we just go back to least common denominator and say everything's a VM and we just deploy it, we lose a lot of the benefits of each of those native clouds. So I want those benefits, but at the same time, there's certain things, especially around security, governance, policy management, that I want to be able to apply holistically. And that's what Azure Arc is targeted for. And so ultimately, this is the ability to, let me go to the next slide, to take the experience that you're familiar with in Azure, all of those management services, RBAC control, being able to build out blueprints and policies and push those down automatically, get reporting on audit reports and governance reports on how the environment is being used, interact with Azure through the portal and through the CLI and through the REST API. all of that stuff that you expect to see in Azure, but actually to expand it out so that you can use those same tools through Arc in an environment not running in Azure. And so that might be your own on-prem data center environment. It could be a Kubernetes environment running in any other cloud. It could be VMs running someplace else. And so that you have a single pane of glass, common workflow where you can apply policy across your entire organization, even though some elements of that infrastructure are deployed into different environments. Okay, this approach to hybrid really goes after, I think, the heart of the reasons why you deploy hybrid strategy to begin with. But it also addresses some of those challenges in doing so. The operational cost of maintaining workloads across multiple environments is going to be higher than maintaining them in one. There's just no other way to look at that, right? It's always going to be true. But but it's almost also like living in this constant state of limbo where you have sort of one foot in this door and one foot over here, and it's really hard to get the full value out of both of them. And so Arc simplifies this just by standardizing that subset of tools that go after governance and policy, right? Deployment management. It doesn't attempt to replace all of the specialized tools that you would use in order to manage those resources on-prem directly, but it gives you an overarching view of the environment as a whole. And I think this automation that is enabled through something like Arc is a sort of key principle to that second truth, right? I want to double click a little bit on this middle icon here though, right? Adopt developer cloud practices on-prem. And the idea here, right, is I'm sure you guys have all heard of DevOps by now, DevSecOps, GitOps as variations on that theme. The idea is that you create more robust solutions through rapid iteration around this circle, right? Everyone's working on a common code base, an agile development plan. They usually follow sprints of some sort rather than a traditional waterfall project plan. And then they use continuous integration to always be testing the code that they're writing, and continuous deployment to be constantly deploying that code out to test environments and to production, sometimes multiple times a day. GitOps is really how you can leverage the second truth in your organization. What did I say? That old school traditional IT playbook isn't going to work, right? Because manual checklists, gates that we have to go through in order to deploy something are really sort of somewhat incompatible with a cloud mentality. If I want to iterate my new mobile app for my customers and I have to deploy a new update every week or even every month, then that traditional IT gated approach to deployment really just slows everything down and falls apart really quickly. We don't want to skip those steps. They're important to secure the application. But instead, we actually want to codify them, embed them into an automated process so that we never miss them again. And one of the benefits of doing this is that we can do something we call shifting left, right? That we can, many studies have shown that the longer it takes to find a problem, the more expensive it is to fix it. This is true of bugs and defects in software. It's also true of security problems in the environment. And so if we can find those problems further left, earlier in the process, it makes it a lot cheaper and a lot easier for us to fix them. But I've never worked for a security organization that said that they had enough people, they had enough time in order to really deeply embed with development teams and make that happen. They're forced to manage sort of a gated process where they review what's been done and either can approve or reject. But by moving to a shift left mentality, we can actually codify the work that the security team has done into the developer's daily routine. And as you can see from the chart on the right here, right, there are a lot more developers out there than there are security professionals. And so I'd rather take the security pros' time to build a repeatable process and bake it into the developer's daily job. That means that every time they commit code, every time they think about a change, whether it be to the software application, or since we're talking about infrastructure as code, since we're talking about cloud and software-defined networks and servers and applications, then every time they make a change to their infrastructure, security has eyes on it. Their automated process is running, approving it, and if they've done something wrong, it gets blocked right on that very first moment, so that they can go and correct it, and it never has to make it further down the street. This is, I think, just one of the many implications that shifting to a cloud native model, to a hybrid environment, has on security. If you have to secure multiple environments, your ability to scale is going to be tied directly to your ability to automate all of those environments. And that in turn is going to greatly benefit by being able to standardize to common platforms wherever possible, even though the target environments might differ. Now that we've talked about DevOps, we typically talk about testing and deployment, CI/CD. That's what most of what people think of when they think about DevOps, but it's really important to remember that full circle. The whole thing only works when we get telemetry back from operations into the DevOps loop. So another, I think, example of Azure's sort of hybrid strength here is tools like Azure Security Center, which is our cloud-native Azure monitoring platform for security telemetry that can gather that telemetry not just from workloads running in Azure, but also workloads running on-prem, in other clouds, across a wide variety of different IT resources. So you can monitor them all in one place. You can look for correlation across clouds. You could alert on events that take place across clouds. And then as we gather this security telemetry from our own deployments, we can marry it with a cloud-native SIEM tool in Azure called Sentinel, with telemetry coming from SaaS offerings, telemetry from Office 365, telemetry that tells us about how our desktop users and our developers are collaborating. How are they sharing content outside of our cloud environment? And how is that impacting the security of our overall topology? So again, like Azure Sentinel, absolutely a core piece of Azure, but it's something that expands beyond what we traditionally consider the public cloud to hybrid scenarios, so that you can start to march down this path of using common tool sets in order to manage a variety of target environments. The question then is, like, how far does this go? Every slide I put up sort of introduces another concept or another topic, another product that builds on each other in order to expand the reach of what is Azure beyond our 60 data centers. By including Azure in your hybrid cloud strategy, you get the full benefit of Azure's own security efforts provisioned against your workloads, right? The truth is that this is only possible because of extreme automation. This is sort of us practicing what I'm preaching here. We're able to share these insights with you, security risks that we see across our environment that you might not have detected yet, that you might not have detected just looking at your ecosystem, just looking at one cloud environment. But if you look across them and you get this telemetry that we see across Office 365, Hotmail, Xbox, Outlook.com, and dozens of other services, Windows Update, Windows Defender, then your workloads are naturally benefiting from that security telemetry that we're getting as well. And that takes me, I'm running up pretty close to the end of my time. It takes me to the third truth, because this is all about building on the work of others, right? The cloud is so strong because you gain the benefit of 3,500 security experts when you put a workload in Azure. You don't need to pay those 3,500 security experts, but your security professionals can now concentrate on things that are really specific to your business. They're building on top of the work that we're doing in order to build the platform. And I think it goes beyond just a service consumer or server, a platform client relationship. This is, in our opinion, this is the new playbook. This is something that we've manifested within Microsoft, and it's more about culture change, right? It's about the role of community in the cloud. Because let's be clear, cloud simply would not exist in its current form if it wasn't for the open source community. It's true of every major software provider. It's true of Microsoft. It's true of every major cloud. We've all had to build on the great development of the open source community in order to grow this environment so fast and so quickly. And in the process, Microsoft has become a really strong advocate of the open source community. And we think that it's important not only to us, but we think that it's important to you. And we think it's important to do more than just use open source software, right? Yes, that's a shortcut to maybe quickly releasing your product or your service because you can reuse some open source components. But long-term sustainable engagement with the open source community has really been critical for us already in building this platform that has maximum flexibility and choice. So what do? Well, we do integrate open source projects into our services and at the same time contribute back to these open source projects as members of the Linux Foundation, the Open Compute Project. We release our own thousands of open source projects just in the last, I would say, 5 to 8 years has really Microsoft sort of seen this religion. And we've very quickly become a real leader in the enterprise and commercial space advocating and supporting open source. We have something like 200,000 open source components in use at Microsoft today, and we have, I think, over 30,000 engineers that are actively contributing to open source projects on GitHub, for example. And so we're surely benefiting from that open source community, and we're doing our best to pay that back and pay that forward so that our clients can then benefit from it as well. Yeah, I said that, so we've been actively building as we design and develop new applications, new services to host on Azure or to release to our customers. Where it makes sense, we want to make those open source available and get the community to participate in those as well. On the right is, I think it shows in no greater place than when we look at our contributions across Kubernetes, something that built out of the Google and the Google community, obviously has become, by far the de facto standard for orchestration of containers across modern applications and even some infrastructure workloads. And in order to embrace that and adopt it within Azure, make it available for our clients, we didn't want to fork it and make it our version of Kubernetes. We want it to be open source Kubernetes. And where we see that there's opportunities for us to make it better, we commit those back up into upstream so that the whole community, even if you're running Kubernetes on-prem or in another cloud, you can get those benefits as well that were built by Microsoft engineers. I think that this applies not just to Microsoft, but to you. It turns out that something like 90% of source code that runs in enterprise line of business applications is actually open source. And so whether you know it or not, most likely you're actively running open source workloads in production today. And so it's this relationship that we are building that I think really starts to shine when we think about what is your interaction with the open source community, and then how can you learn from what the open source community has built in order to improve your own internal practices and processes. And this is something that we've internalized at Microsoft over the last, say, 5 or 6 years, is moving towards what we call an inner source model. And we advocate for this through our friends over at GitHub, so that you can build within the confines of your own firewall, within the confines of your protected space, an open source culture that leads to better quality software and better quality and more secure software as well, without having to open source it necessarily to the world, but just to build on those principles. Finally, and I know I'm going to wrap up here, you can see there's a lot to think about when you talk about multi-cloud, when you think about hybrid, when you think about open source. And we've talked about infrastructure, applications, security, monitoring. We talked a little bit about licensing. But one more, there's some legal implications, right? That if you're building applications to host for your customers and you're leveraging open source software, or you're running in a cloud that uses open source software, then there is some risk of patent trolls and other ne'er-do-wells that are just out to make a buck. They might come after you. And we've had customers in all industries have to deal with this problem. Occasionally it hits the news when there's a really big patent troll that makes a splash against a large corporate entity. Microsoft, for our Azure customers, has created a program called IP Advantage that allows us to collaborate with you legally, so that if somebody does come after you and say, hey, that open source component that you're using, we have a patent for that, or this service that you're using happens to be using an open source component that we have questions about, then our legal team will work with you. We will actually give you access to our library of patents in order to defend yourself. We'll offer springing licenses for those patents so that you don't have to pay us or others in response to these types of legal actions. And so this is a unique advantage that we think that we can provide to Azure customers, again, as you're making choices about how you're going to deploy in a hybrid multi-cloud environment. We want to think about all dimensions across this. Okay, so I said I was going to cover these 3 truths. I think that these are 3 things that are super critical in anybody's deployment to any cloud, right? There are the majority of our clients, the majority of the enterprises in the world where hybrid is going to be a multi-dimensional challenge. It's going to be reality for short, medium, and potentially long term, as there are workloads that just make more sense to run on the edge or to run closer to your customers than you can in a public cloud. As you do that, you're going to have to shift left your thinking on security and governance, how you manage and deploy these workloads in a more cloud native, fully automated way in order to get the full benefit out of them. And as you do that, I highly recommend, look at it through the lens of the open source community and what you can learn from the collaboration that has happened there for decades. And we're just now starting to learn how to take advantage of in the enterprise space. The companies that I've worked with that have really started to adopt this, their rate of acceleration on innovation and being able to adopt new technologies has noticeably faster than those that are still working through sort of a waterfall gated process. We'd be happy to work with you on any of these. As Ron knows, I'm always available.